Welcome, welcome everyone. If we haven't met by Zoom or in person yet, I'm Sarah Qureshi, the Program Director for the Baltimore Jewish Film Festival. Thank you for joining us for our virtual talkback to discuss The Keeper. First, I also want to offer our thanks to Har Sinai Oheb Shalom Congregation for sponsoring this film. We also thank our online community gathering sponsor, Baltimore Israel Coalition. We are grateful to all of our festival and season sponsors, and in just a moment, you'll see a full list of those in the chat feature of Zoom. Our guest speaker today is Baltimore Jewish Film Festival favorite Professor Christopher Reed, Chair of the Film and Media Studies Department at Stevenson University. Chris, we can't wait to hear your insights on this film and on the biopic genre, so you're up.
So thank you so much, Sarah. Thank you for inviting me once more to be a speaker at the Baltimore Jewish Film Festival. I'm so sorry that it has to be virtually, but we all know why. Hope everyone enjoys my virtual background of the movie poster behind me. And what I'd like to do is start off by reading a draft of a review. It may change, especially based on what comes out of this conversation, because the film is yet to be released in the United States. So it's just a draft of my thoughts after watching the film. So I'll start with that. And then I want to talk a little bit about the biopic genre, et cetera, before we start having some questions. So thank you again for having me. Here we go. Born in 1923, Bernhard Karl Troutman was an unlikely eventual goalkeeper for England's Manchester City soccer team, given that he enlisted at 17 in the German army after first joining the Hitler Youth. An enthusiastic believer in the Nazi Führer's energetic plans for his country, as he saw them, he went off to war and, by all accounts, as evidenced by his awarded medals, including an Iron Cross, performed his soldierly duties with not only distinction, but gusto. Still, as vigorous a supporter of some aspects of Hitler's policies as he was nevertheless deeply marked by some of the massacres he witnessed, which went far beyond his own actions. Because of his voluntary and active participation in the armed services, Troutman was deemed one of the 10% unrepentant Nazis when he landed in a British POW camp after the war. It was there, however, that his life began its trajectory for the better. German director Markus Rosenmüller passes over much, if not all, of this backstory in his biographic film, The Keeper, called Troutman when it was released in Germany. A Bavarian filmmaker who played semi-professional soccer himself, Rosenmüller only first encountered Troutman's story about 10 years ago, since the man is little known in his native land. And that is because Troutman's claim to fame in life is from his time spent playing in England for the Manchester City, or Man City for short, team, which he did from 1949 to 1964. It's the lead up to how that happened that is most on Rosenmüller and co-writer Nicholas Schofield's minds as they explore issues of truth and reconciliation in their rousing tribute to the power of love and forgiveness. Though they simplify Troutman's story quite a bit, the result is a brisk, moving tale bolstered by fine lead performances. These would be from David Cross, who was in The Reader many years ago with Kate Winslet, and Balloon from a few years ago as Troutman, and Freya Mavor, who's been in films like The Sense of an Ending, as Margaret, daughter of the man who first gives Troutman an opportunity to play soccer outside the camp and whom he eventually marries. Though in real life, their marriage eventually ended in divorce, their love story here is not without its significant challenges and tragedy. It's in their interactions that the script explores the politics of pardon. There's also an important contribution from Manchester's communal rabbi, Alexander Altman, who writes an open letter asking his city to keep an open mind about the former Nazi. It's unfortunate that we don't get to know more about this seminal figure who had lost his parents in the Holocaust, as it is the actions of such sage leaders, it is through the actions of such sage leaders that the world becomes a better place. There have been so many cinematic treatments of World War II and its aftermath, not to mention the Holocaust, that it is always refreshing to witness a new approach to these well-worn topics. Certainly that era was momentous and horrific enough in its details to warrant the depth and breadth of its endless dissection. But as a film goer, a movie like The Keeper can be a welcome change. We can enjoy the journey and the on-field soccer playing as much as the intellectual and emotional arguments for and against absolution. Score 1 for Team Rosenmüller. So as you heard in my review, Rosenmüller, in the draft of my review, Rosenmüller takes some liberties with the historical record. He does not only simplify the actions that Troutman engaged in during the war, but he minimizes the activeness of his participation in both Hitler Youth and then the army. He also, as anyone who's seen the film knows, ends the movie well before the end of the marriage of Margaret and Bert, who Bert Troutman would later say Margaret, understandably, never quite recovered from the death of her son. At least the filmmakers keep that in the movie. And Bert later remarried, actually, a few times. And that is completely left out of the film and from the end credits when you might expect the filmmaker to include details such as that. That's not to say that Rosenmüller has done something in that regard that goes against that part of the historical record. It's just a choice. And that is what I find interesting when one is examining biographical pictures, or biopics as they are so called, which is this choice of what to include and what not, and how much do the filmmaker's choices affect historical truth. A few years ago, director Ava DuVernay ran into some trouble with historians over her movie Selma, in which she seems to indicate that LBJ, Lyndon Baines Johnson, had ordered the FBI to implicate MLK, Martin Luther King, in some actions and to order surveillance of him. And this outraged many historians who felt like this was doing a disservice to Lyndon Baines Johnson. Now, I think Selma is an excellent film. Certainly, Steven Spielberg in his Lincoln noticeably left out the contributions of people like Frederick Douglass in the emancipation of America's slaves. That film, perhaps because it was directed by a white man and not an African-American woman, garnered far less negative attention because of that omission and that change. Filmmakers always make choices in their scripts when they're using real life events. Some of the biopics that I like tend to focus on small events, much as The Keeper does, rather than portraying a full life. They're keeping the focus shorter in order to be able to go more in depth into the characters' lives. Certainly there are films like Ray, starring Jamie Foxx as Ray Charles, that I think do a fine job with a larger scope. But I often enjoy, and I'm guessing I'm probably not the only one, films that manage to do these shorter treatments or try something a little bit more experimental. A few years ago, there was a very interesting film called Love and Mercy about Brian Wilson of the Beach Boys that was split into two parts. In the first part, and I shouldn't say first and second because they're intercut, but in the, shall we say, earlier part in terms of chronology, Brian Wilson is played by the actor Paul Dano. In the later parts, he's played by John Cusack. And this is after Brian Wilson has had a breakdown and has fallen under the unfortunate influence of a psychologist who is over-medicating him. And you have two different actors playing him. And I think it's quite a nice way to treat it because they're very different in their performances. And Brian Wilson, of course, was quite different by that point in the film. If you haven't seen Love and Mercy, and if you're a fan of the Beach Boys, I definitely recommend that film. I also really enjoyed from a few years ago, I, Tonya, about Tonya Harding, which took a very ironic approach to dealing with a figure much maligned in the past 20 years, perhaps to rehabilitate her, but also just to give a different perspective on that character. A film like Margareta von Trotto's Hannah Arendt focuses on that philosophers, that great writers, time writing her articles that would become her book, Eichmann in Israel. And it's a very interesting movie as well. Just last year, we had A Beautiful Day in the Neighborhood by director Mariel Heller, which takes, again, an unconventional approach in its portrait of the beloved Mr. Rogers. Then you had Judy, also last year, about Judy Garland, that focuses not on Judy in her heyday, although it does flash back to when she was a child, but on Judy Garland in the 50s when things were not, in the 60s when things were not going so well for her. So these are some of the more recent biopics that I have enjoyed. In terms of films about World War II and or the Holocaust, again, there are plenty of worthy treatments, documentary and fiction, that have treated the subject with the gravity that it deserves. But there have been films such as the 1999 Aimé and Jaguar, about a lesbian love affair between a Jewish woman and the wife of an SS officer. That's quite an interesting treatment, tangentially, of the Holocaust. The Counterfeiters from 2007, that deals with Jewish prisoners not initially imprisoned because of the Holocaust, who are in prison already, and then are drafted by the Nazis to help them counterfeit international currency to destabilize economies. That's a very interesting film. And then, of course, there was 1945 that I presented at the JCC a few years ago that takes place in Hungary at the end of the war and shows the aftermath without actually showing us anything directly, that I thought was really a wonderful film. So, you know, in terms of biopics and films that deal with World War II, I'm always looking for something that can go outside of the ordinary. So I think that covers my introductory remarks and my discussing the changes that the filmmaker made. I'd be curious to hear your questions and to have a conversation. So somebody wrote, for my biopic POV was a story of the boy. From what I've been able to find, so I don't know if everyone can see, well, actually, I'm not reading these in order. Let me go with the first question. Was that bath at the end of the film an info experience or bath?
Chris, that refers to a different movie. You can skip on from that. And
okay.
Before you move on to these questions, I sort of feel like you covered it to a certain degree, but I did get a question in advance, and I wanted to share it, and maybe you could make some connections with what you've already shared. So some of our viewers did mention that they did some personal research about the figure, and in doing so read conflicting information, that he was in fact a Nazi supporter and a member of the Hitler Youth, as you said. And they wanted to ask about the discrepancy and about how he was portrayed and how his war actions and beliefs were minimized. And what can you say about this difference in terms of the information that they learned and creative license that might have been taken, if you have anything else to add about that?
Yes, well, I think it should be no mystery, perhaps, why a director might want to minimize a character's participation in the atrocities of World War II. What Troutman actually did in World War II, beyond just be like a super soldier for a while, I don't think we know exactly if he participated. There's a question in the chat too, if he served in a concentration camp. That, I think we're pretty clear he did not. But whether he participated in atrocities or not, we do know, and there's a 2013 book that you can read, a 2010 book called Troutman's Journey from Hitler Youth to FA Cup Legend by Katrina Clay, which she co-wrote with him, with his participation, so we can take that, the truths within, with a grain of salt. But in that book, he talks about how he and a soldier buddy came across a massacre in the woods of, I think it was Jewish partisans. And that was something that horrified them. So it's one thing to be serving in the army and to be a believer in the abstract in these policies as a 17-year-old. It's another thing to be confronted with the reality of wartime atrocities. And he at least claimed years later that that was a really seminal moment for him in terms of witnessing something horrific and sort of starting to come to an understanding perhaps of what he'd signed up for. Yeah, but I have not had time to read this book, Troutman's Journey from Hitler Youth to FA Cup Legend, but I've read some extracts from it. And, you know, again, he talks about sort of that kind of experience as being something that affected him deeply. He also thought that if anyone had known that he and his buddy had seen it, that they themselves would have been executed because the SS liked to keep those executions secret. So
do you think that incident relates to what one of our guests is asking about, the story of the boy that he had in his memory that he failed to save? And do we know if that's fiction or fact, or is that some kind of reference to the event you're talking about?
I think that's a reference, a metaphorical reference to that. I have not found anything to support that actually happened. And even if it were in the book, again, any biography that's written in conjunction with the subject as the primary source, you have to take those truths with a major grain of salt, particularly when someone's writing that at the end of their life. But no, I haven't seen anything to support that. But it makes, you know, there are many liberties taken in the movie that I was able to find beyond the ones I've said already. For example, he did not, as a boy, sort of go out and play goalkeeper. It wasn't until he was in the prisoner of war camp that he started playing keeper. So that was not something that, like, as a boy, he was champion goalkeeper, and this was his lifelong dream. So there are these liberties that they've taken for whatever reason to sort of create a narrative trajectory that suited what they wanted. So should I look at other questions?
Let me ask you, let me relay one of the questions that refers to some of the scenes with Margaret, and maybe you can tell us how you think that they fit into the story arc, and whether or not their courtship was accelerated, or what the significance you might think about some of the beach scenes would be.
Yeah, so I think those beach scenes, that part of the film, to be honest, felt a little bit less dramatically developed than perhaps earlier parts of the film. But I think you need to have this moment of both emotional conflict, because this is such a serious thing that's happened to the couple, and also some kind of reconciliation, because they did go on and have other children. Interestingly, there's a question in the chat about the lives of his two surviving children. He actually had a daughter from a previous relationship, and he only sort of reunited with her much, much later. So that, of course, is completely left out of the film. I find that interesting as well, because that also would muddy the waters of this, likable character that, could still be likable if you wrote that in, but that they chose to keep out. So, but there's a question about whether I know anything about the lives of his two surviving children. I do not. I just know that he had other children. And like I said, one was from before the marriage. That we see in the film. But in terms of the way the film deals with that at the end, I just think that they are trying for some cinematic shorthand of what surely was a lengthy period of recovery from what is a horrific moment in their lives and in the movie when their child is hit by a car.
So another question that has been posed, and I think this would be along the lines with his actions in terms of his service and the war. But another viewer has indicated, having read, that actually personally he was abrasive and ruthless, whereas he's presented more kind and sympathetic in the film. And how does that sync with what you've learned and how it works in terms of the film?
Well, it's interesting because I read an interview with David Cross, who was reading the biography that I mentioned while he was preparing the film. And I don't think well, at least according to the interview, I don't think that he sees Troutman as portrayed in the film as necessarily kind and sympathetic, because he talks about how this is a change for him, playing somebody so angry. And he said, usually I play such nice guys, and here I am playing somebody with all this anger. He did grow up as a working class kid, probably had some social class resentment. That I can't speak to whether he was always filled with anger beyond what David Cross is saying. But I have as well been reading that he was certainly, he was captured a few times during World War II. He escaped. So he was, yes, ruthless and very physically brave, which is something that he is most celebrated for in Manchester because of that match that we see where he broke his neck and yet continued to play and make saves. That is actually one of the more historically accurate parts of the film, that he broke his neck playing the match, continued to save balls, and that is one of his major claims to fame in the city. And so it's not hard to imagine that somebody with those characteristics of physical bravery might also have other attendant characteristics to go along with it. But yes, I have also read that he was certainly unapologetic at first about his service in World War II, and then a little bit abrasive as well. So they definitely soften him for the movie. But again, it's interesting that that's not how the actor who played him saw it.
So we also have a question if you think that the overall message of the film, the theme is that somehow his involvement as a football player in England somehow redeemed him from his past with the German military and Hitler Youth.
Yeah, so certainly Rosenmüller would disagree that it's about football redeeming him. He's said a number of times in different interviews that he regrets, as a child of the generation of Germans after the war, so he's too young to be that generation, but that he really regrets that in Germany there was not a Truth and Reconciliation Commission, much as Desmond Tutu set up in South Africa, which allowed people to confess to the things they'd done, to get it out in the open, to talk about it, and sees that one of the biggest challenges of that generation was that people just pretended like they had not participated and did not talk about it, hid the truth. And so it took the student revolts of the 1960s for a lot of this information to come out. And that's a really interesting take on it. And so what, in part, he's seeing this, the idea of love and acceptance, and this idea that, you need to talk about your sins, your crimes, in order to be able to overcome them. And I think that's what he would see as a message of his film, that football, it's an important part of Bert Troutman's story, but that's not really what redeemed him as much as it was these interactions with Margaret and her family, and the rabbi whom, for my money, I think we see far too little of in the film.
Well, speaking of that, I have a question that was sent to me directly. This question revolves around the Jewish community's interest in the sport, in the game, and whether or not that was exaggerated for purposes of the movie, or is more authentic, and how that relates to the rabbi's role in the movie.
Well, no, apparently that's not an exaggeration. Like, there was a big Jewish fan base in Man City, which is a city that had a large Jewish population And so no, that apparently is historically accurate, as is the fact that when the rabbi penned his letter, the protest stopped. So that's fairly accurate. Again, I would have liked to have seen more of that character because I found him interesting, his thought process on going through with that. By the way, someone's asking, I don't want to jump your question, but I just want to address this while I'm thinking of it. Someone's asking about the cemetery fight scene with Bert and Smythe. I think Smythe is a largely invented character. If anyone's a fan of the Harry Potter films, I just want to point out that that character, Smythe, is played by Dudley Dursley, the actor who played Dudley Dursley in the Harry Potter films. He has a far more interesting role in the Coen brothers Western that they put on Netflix a few years ago, the title of which I'm forgetting right now, where he plays a man without arms and without legs. It's a really brilliant performance. He was okay here, but if any of you did not know that that's who he was, that's who he was. But no, he's that's a fairly invented character. I'm a composite of various folks.
Well, more generally, could you speak a little bit about invented characters, composite characters, and how they help tell the long stories of biographies?
Yep. So I will, but I will warn you that I am not a fan of composite characters in biopics because often, I mean, I understand why people do them. It's easier, right? You're trying to tell a story in 90 minutes to 2 hours, maybe 2.5 hours, and it's difficult. You want to honor the historical facts, or at least I hope you do. You want to honor at least some kind of truth or truthiness about the character. But you only have so much time unless you're making a Netflix series, which is an option. You can do a miniseries and then you have more time. But even then, you have to make choices. So I understand why people do composite characters, but it never. For example, that movie I was just mentioning about Mr. Rogers. There's a lot of invention in there, and there's a whole emotional arc in that film, A Beautiful Day in the Neighborhood, over the journalist's character's father. Who is a big part of that film. That's a complete invention. It had nothing to do with anything that happened in real life. And so, yes, I found the film moving in many ways. But when I discover that I have invested emotionally in a character who did not exist, I will not lie that I find that sometimes somewhat troubling. So I mind it far less a character like Smythe, who is far more incidental to the plot. And I certainly would see why you might have a character like that say and do things that are important to advance the story. But it bothers me more when it's somebody who's like an integral part of the story and we're investing emotional energy and they weren't real. Because a lot of the times why we find biopics interesting and why we decide to watch them is because they are ostensibly about real stories. It's the same thing if you were watching a documentary and it turned out at the end that it wasn't a documentary at all, that it was filled with actors and it had been shot like a documentary. And here you thought you were watching something. And it's not like a movie like This Is Spinal Tap, where everyone's in on the joke that it's a mockumentary. You'd probably be a little bit upset that you invested emotional energy. This is less egregious because we know going in that it's a fictionalized treatment of real life. But I think we still have an expectation that what we're investing in at least is close to the truth.
Chris, since I don't see too many.
I see a funny question that I can't.
Go for it.
So the question, if everyone sees, is about the actor who played the coach of Man City from his role in Outlander. And I do not have thoughts on the series Outlander because I have not watched it. And part of the reason I have not watched it is because I actually did read the first book in the series, and there was just a little bit too much rape for me. I understand. I like the historical sci-fi fantasy aspect of the film, of the book, very much. It's exactly the kind of fiction I enjoy. But I decided then I wasn't going to watch it. Though I like that actress very much. She was in the film last year, Ford v Ferrari. Speaking of biopics, hey, there's an interesting one. I like that. That takes some liberties as well, but that's an excellent biopic, Ford v Ferrari, with Christian Bale and Matt Damon, and the actress from Outlander who has a Scottish name that I will not even attempt to pronounce. is the wife of Christian Bale's character in that, and she does a lot with what could be a throwaway part as the wife. So those are my thoughts on Outlander. That actor, by the way, that you like so much is named Gary Lewis, and I like him too, even if I have not seen Outlander.
So, Chris, I've put in a last call for questions, and while I give people a few more moments to think about that, do you have any other last thoughts or questions you'd like to put out to our viewers about The Keeper?
Well, I mean, if we were having a conversation back and forth, I would be curious to hear, how much it bothers other people when there are liberties taken. I mean, I find this film quite successful in many ways, and again, it's a nice, refreshing take on a well-worn topic. But not most films aren't perfect, and I'm sure people have feelings about the what people do with biopics. And if anyone had any thoughts on that, I would love to know. Meanwhile, I see a question about new films coming out for me to recommend. So I'm just looking at my list of upcoming films so that I can share that information.
Well, while Chris does that, I recommend the next 4 films in Baltimore Jewish Film Festival series.
That's an excellent recommendation. I don't know if people are fans of the comedians Steve Coogan and Rob Brydon, but they have together starred in now 4 films called The Trip. There was The Trip, there was The Trip to Italy, The Trip to Spain, and now there's The Trip to Greece. And for my money, The Trip to Greece, which was just released last week on VOD, so you can find it anywhere you can rent movies online, is the best since the original The Trip. So if you know who these guys are, of course, Steve Coogan was in the film Philomena a few years ago, which he wrote as well as starred in. He's been going for more dramatic roles. Rob Brydon is a very well-known comedian within the UK, but together they are a lot of fun. So I recommend that. I also recommend a film called Judy and Punch, which is sort of a revisionist take / backstory on the Punch and Judy puppet show. That was kind of fun. If you're a fan of Mexican cuisine, there's a documentary that just came out about nonagenarian Diana Kennedy, famed for her cookbooks on Mexican cooking. Then there is a film coming out on July 3rd, also a documentary called John Lewis, Good Trouble, about the Georgia congressman, which I recommend. Speaking of Selma, he was, of course, on the Edmund Pettus Bridge during that march. And looking at my other list here, there's also a film, speaking of this time events before World War II, coming out in June called Mr. Jones. It's about British journalist Gareth Jones, who was one of the first to report on the upcoming famine in the Soviet Union in the 1930s that wiped out untold numbers of Soviet peasants. And of course, everyone ignored what he was saying. There's also a series that dropped on Netflix today called Jeffrey Epstein, Filthy Rich, about the late financier and abuser of young women. It's a 4-part series. It's difficult to watch at times, but I recommend it. It's very powerful. And there's a film that opens this Friday called The High Note that stars Tracee Ellis Ross of Blackish, who also happens to be Diana Ross's daughter, and Dakota Johnson. So these sort of 2 Hollywood royalty characters playing in a film where Dakota Johnson is the personal assistant of Tracee Ellis Ross's diva. It's a really entertaining film that I recommend, The High Note. It'll be available on VOD starting on Friday.
So Chris, I've got one last question, and after this, we're gonna say thank you and good night to everyone. But we have a viewer who would like you to speak about the theme of moving on from loss, and what comments you might have about the terrible loss on all sides with regard to the war and the tragic family loss.
Right. Well, I mean, who am I to tell people how to react or how to move on from loss? I think that's often a very individual choice on how you are going to do so. Again, I was moved the more I read about Rabbi Altman's decision to write that letter, because I think somebody who had lost his parents in the Holocaust being so open to forgiveness to a man who had served as a Nazi soldier, is as moving to me as somebody like Nelson Mandela coming out of prison years, over 2 decades of prison in South Africa, and being able to forgive enough, or to realize that the only way forward was to engage in acts of truth and reconciliation, which is different than forgiveness per se, but it's an idea of having discussions, because otherwise you'll have these never-ending cycles. I think it's very wise. I think every situation is different, and I have no personal insights beyond seeing people like this as models, inspiring models of how humanity would be, at its best if we could follow their leads.
Well, we would like to thank you once again, Professor Reed, for coming to talk to us about the biography film genre. And we appreciate that you come back to talk to our viewers year after year. You are a film festival favorite, and we appreciate your time. And I want to send my thanks to everyone else for joining us this evening. Remind you that we don't just have 4 more films coming up, but 3 more post-film discussions. One with the director of the documentary After Munich, and 2 other community discussions where we all just share our thoughts together. So please watch your emails and the website for information to join us for those discussions. Thank you very much. We were glad to have all of you this evening. Good night.
All right.